Hello. So here I am with Nick Mayhew Smith, sitting in a little wooden house in just by Kew Gardens, um, and I met Nick a while back when you invited me onto that television program that you were doing, wasn't it? Remind me what the program was called?
Well, it was pagans and pilgrims.
Pagans and Pilgrims, that's right. And we met at that place in Dorset,
Knowlton Henge.
Knowlton Henge. That's right, and had a discussion together. And we sat. I remember sitting in the pub, talking about and discovering to our horror that we had done. There were so many points of similarity, weren't there? We both lived in New Zealand. We
Yes.
were both naturists. We were both sort of interested in the same things and so on. And it was really great.
Nature spirituality. I am your evil twin, Philip. It's true. I'm the Christian version of you. With
Nick is the Christian version, the evil twin of me. And he's come out with a fantastic book called The Naked Hermit, A Journey to the Heart of Celtic Britain, which I received the other day. And it looks beautiful for a start, I have to say. It's just beautifully produced with lovely photos and so on. And I've started reading it. I have, since you're Christian, maybe I should take confession with you. And I'll confess right from the beginning of this interview that I haven't read the book because I only just received it very recently. But I've started reading it, and I really like what I'm reading. And you tell me, give me the overview. What's it about?
Yeah, well, it's a book that looks at what we call the Celtic period of sort of spirituality and culture in Britain. That period after the Romans had left and before Britain became really an established kind of Christian and a sort of major power. That kind of transition period when paganism slowly evolved into Christian worship and devotion across the country. It's the conversion period is another word for it. Early medieval period. In academia, you get told off for calling it the Dark Ages, but it is a period.
But it's
where we
that
know
period.
very little.
And
That period.
you studied that period for your PhD, didn't you?
Yes, I did, and I wanted to look very specifically at one point, which is what were people doing? Why is there so much focus on the natural world in that period? The evidence we have talks of sacred trees and holy mountains, of wilderness areas, of animals interacting with people, and above all the water, the lakes, the rivers, the springs, and so on were a huge focus of sort of activity and devotional ritual activity. And I wanted to know why. Why on earth were people so focused on the outdoors?
And that's why I think this book is so interesting, and why I think a lot of Druids and people interested in Druidry and nature spirituality will be interested in it. Precisely because you've chosen to explore a very specific area, haven't you? Which is you have gone around Britain, taking your clothes off and immersing yourself in the water in very special places, as in a deliberate way, in an attempt to reenact or some very early Celtic Christian rituals. And I know you've got very interesting things to say about the relationship with paganism. So maybe you can start off by saying, because I remember when we finished filming all those years ago at Knowlton, you said that the next project you were working on was wild swimming. You were really getting into wild swimming, weren't you?
Yeah, correct, absolutely.
Which is a big thing nowadays. And was it your interest in wild swimming combined with your sort of PhD studies that got you going? How did you get to this specific practice of naked bathing?
Well, I'd always seen there was I'd looked at holy places before, and we did that television program on holy places, and I just thought there was a real gap in understanding what people did at them. So on the one hand, I did a PhD to understand through the texts and to understand the evidence and looking at the archaeological traces such as they were, to try and put together why were people bathing, what was going on. But then I think the real key bit for me was then actually going and thinking, well, I've got some rituals, I think I know what they did. Then actually to go out there into the wilderness and to do it again, to recreate rituals which have fallen into disuse for 1500 years, and to see if they re-energise me and they re-energise the place. And my word, they did. It knocked me over, and not just because it was flipping cold at times, but it was a real wake-up call, and it was phenomenal. I am a naturist, and I've written books on skinny dipping in the past, so I'm probably, in terms
You
of
were
a boring
primed.
academic, I was more primed than most
Yeah.
and more willing, in fact keen, one would say, to go out there and stuck into the wilderness and strip off and jump in. So I had that by chance, I suppose, that kind of affinity with natural water and wilderness. So I think it lent me a dimension to my research, which suddenly, when I started actually doing it and trying to work out what these rituals were like when you actually go there in the water, that opened up the whole world to me, and I suddenly saw them through very different eyes. They were real. I mean, the descriptions were not just poetic conventions, as many scholars say, and they weren't just sort of intellectual or literary stories that were designed to impress people. They were actually descriptions of what people did, because it maps so much onto the bodily experience of getting in there, singing along. And there's one story about Cuthbert singing along to the sound of the waves, his psalms, and all the other critics and historians just say, well, obviously that's just made up. It's based on Virgil, and it's all of a poetic
Yes.
little thing. But I went out there and then tried it, and actually a psalm is sung. You sing a line of a psalm, and then you wait for a response. And it occurred to me only when I was doing it in this bay which echoes with the waves, that he was singing a line of a psalm and then pausing while a wave broke to punctuate his psalm singing.
Beautiful.
And then he'd sing another line. It was fantastic. And when that all swirled into shape around me in these cold, icy waters, suddenly I was in a completely different space. I was singing along to the heartbeat of the cosmos.
How fantastic! How absolutely wonderful! Because that's one of the key points I think that you make, is that the interpretation has traditionally been that these stories of people immersing themselves in icy water was as mortification of the flesh. That it's a horrible thing to do, to get in cold water, and the only reason you do it is because you were trying to tame the unruly flesh.
Yes.
And therefore, pagans who by nature are hedonists today and love the body, don't hate it, would naturally think that this was a crazy thing to do. But the point you're making is that actually they weren't doing it to mortify the flesh. And I think we're receptive to that idea now because of the popularity of Wim Hof.
Yes,
this
of course.
chap Wim Hof, who my son outlaw is really keen on it, and he swims in Scottish lochs in the winter, and and he absolutely loves it, and has cold showers and so on. And I was listening to Rupert Sheldrake and Mark Vernon talking on their podcast about your book as well, and Rupert Sheldrake was saying his son Merlin was doing it. So I think that's interesting, because people are now open to how we can alter our consciousness, how we can develop spiritually, how we can grow as human beings by sort of pushing the boundary, which is what you're doing. You're going out of your comfort zone, but rather than tell me, when did it occur to you that it wasn't mortification of the flesh? Was it right from the beginning, or was there a point at which you thought, hang on a minute, these practices aren't to mortify the flesh?
It's a very good question, and in fact, you're right. I've talked about the literary significance and interpretation of these, but you're right. The monastic one is also one that dominates. It was seen as a very moral, ascetic act, an act of mortifying the body and killing desire and so on. As a naturist, somebody who enjoys swimming anyway, that doesn't really ring true. I know loads of naturist friends and wild swimmers, and often the two combined. That's never really part of it for any of us. So I wouldn't immediately interpret it that way. And then I was just looking at the sheer weight of evidence, and this is a very specific thing to Britain. There's a lot of emphasis on chastity, mortifying the flesh and so on in other monastic early periods, like St Benedict would go around and roll in nettles and thorns to mortify his flesh. But in Britain they were going into water, and there isn't the sense when you read it that it was any sort of punishment. And there's one very early incident where Columba is bathing, or he goes in the sea to say his night prayers, and it says explicitly in a poem that's very difficult to interpret, but it says explicitly it was not for crimes that he crucified his body on the green waves. So it's like, well, it wasn't for crimes. He wasn't doing it to punish himself.
but it did say crucify.
It's a crucify.
But of course, when you do immerse yourself in cold water like that, it's like the crucifixion and the resurrection, followed rapidly by resurrection, isn't it?
Yes.
I mean, in there's a place called Staffelstein in Germany where I've been a number of times, where you have saunas and you swim in different pools and all the rest of it, and they have buckets of crushed ice available for you to rub on yourself, as well as ice cold pools to dip in. And I remember walking with Stephanie through this area and saying, "Oh, I think I'll try the crushed ice," and she said, "You must be mad," and it is like crucifying yourself for a second.
Yeah.
But then, my God, you feel fantastic afterwards. You do feel reborn, actually.
You do.
You do feel, resurrected. We were at a hammam in Granada.
Excellent.
And again, lovely hot pools, and then a cold pool. And Stephanie quite rightly said, "Well, why go in the cold? Are you mad? Why go in the cold pool?" And I thought, well, I'll try it. It's on offer. I'll try. Immerse myself in the cold pool, get out, feel marvellous. So
Reborn is absolutely the
Reborn,
word.
yeah.
I mean, the imagery is absolutely there. You've got a kind of going through the waters and so on. And I think they would explicitly use that great ritual of rebirth, using water, of course, which is baptism. And the more I looked at these rituals, the more I figured out they were shaped really very, very strongly by baptismal practice.
Yeah.
And baptism at the time in the Celtic Christian areas anyway was followed by foot washing. And there's a story when Cuthbert goes bathing one time, when he was singing along to the waves, he came out and some otters came and dried and wiped his feet, which sounds absolutely absurd. And to me it was one of those very bizarre little kind of details that made no sense at all, until I realised that actually that is how you concluded a Celtic baptism. So this was a very, very complete
By drying the
recapitulation.
feet, yes.
By drying the feet. There was a foot washing at the end of it,
Yes.
because Jesus never performed baptism on other people, but he did wash people's feet.
right, so you brought it in there because of course, Christian baptism for the first 500 years was mandatory to be naked, wasn't it?
It was absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, and it was full immersion.
Yes.
Yeah, and obviously they didn't preheat the water, so they would have been cold. It would have been cold going in, immersing yourself fully in cold water, and yeah,
That's right. The early evidence says it has to be flowing water initially. The very,
Yeah.
very first baptismal kind of instructions we have say it needs to be flowing, which means a river or the sea.
Yeah.
And people would, even the fonts, were probably something you'd kneel in and then have water poured over you. But the idea was you got wet, and therefore you were naked, and those were two sides of the same coin. Nowadays, you get a few drops on an infant's head in the back of our church. Obviously, there's no point stripping off for something like that, because it's very, very token. But the idea that it was full-bodied, full-on immersion for the entirety of you, both physically and spiritually, had to be enacted with you stripping off and getting in the water. So it embodied it.
So you've established that that in Christianity, early Celtic Christianity, these immersion rituals were part of a practice. And were there a number of different rituals, or were they?
Yeah.
Were they? There were.
There were, yes. I sort of filtered through them and categorised them, which shows if you've got far too much time in your hands and you're doing a PhD, it's a kind of the kind of
No, it
thing.
sounds a very worthwhile activity. So, what are the categories that it falls that you
Well,
get?
there were 50 overall in across all of Christendom, and 39 of those are in Britain and Ireland. So we're looking at something that was Celtic, as I say.
Right.
And then within that, I found there were two kind of distinct frames. There's this one, as I say, the crucifying in the waves we're talking about with Columba, crucifying his body on the green waves. And then you've got this ritual that Cuthbert did and others did as well, which sounds much more harmonious, where they were going in and the water was kind of more benign. They were singing along to it. And of course, remember, these otters came out of the water and dried his feet. So there's a sense there that the whole of nature was ministering to the holy man. He was going into the water and he was turning creation, or the physical world, the elements, into something that was benign. He was demonstrating that Christianity had agency, power, ability to redeem the entire landscape. It was a very broad cosmology they had going. So this is one sense they were pushing into the water. It was crucifying. It was dangerous. The story of the Loch Ness Monster appears in this time. There's poisonous and dangerous wells that Columba encounters in Scotland. So there's a real sense of putting the body on the line, going in, crucifying yourself, physically putting yourself in the way of danger on the one hand, and then later on the stories then talk about that being a more benign interaction where nature suddenly not merely you don't really survive it, your crucifixion, come back dead and then reborn, but you actually are being helped. And there's stories
You're blessed by the
you're
water.
blessed by the water.
And
Yeah.
is it only men who are doing this? Are women doing this as well?
There's a few. I say in the book, my patron saint would be St Ethelfleda, who's
Yes.
a nun, believe it or not, a skinny dipping nun.
Yes.
There's a phrase you never thought you'd hear before.
Yes.
Who lived in Romsey Abbey in Hampshire,
Yeah.
genteel Hampshire.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what the locals would make of her now down in Romsey, but she would strip off every night of the year,
Yeah.
according to her hagiography, and go in the water even when there was ice floating past her. Her monastery in Romsey is by the River Test, so that's presumably where she bathed. But she would strip off and go into the water every night of the year and would say her psalms. Again, this singing thing
Singing in the water.
and she did that and lived to a ripe old age, incidentally.
Well, of course, we sing in the bath. There's something about singing and water. Now there's something interesting. You when we were talking earlier, you talked about how you couldn't find any references in the relating to the pre-Christian era to immersion in water, and you feel that pagans felt water was a taboo place. It was the realm of the underworld and so on. And you feel that possibly that this act of Christians going into the water was demonstrating. What were they demonstrating?
The power of one creator God to operate across all levels of creation is
Right.
the best way I can put it, to show that the land could be redeemed, the water could be redeemed by the operation of a holy man or woman who was in touch with the divine. So the idea that there were taboo places in the landscape, and water seems particularly terrifying the further north you get.
Yes,
as
sure.
with the Loch Ness Monster and with the Pictland, the poisoned wells and so on. And there's pictures of the Pictish stones show drownings,
Really?
ritual drownings, people being killed with legs poking out of cauldrons and so on, of the way that people would be killed. So, and there's also the beheading wells where they found skull deposits and so on, which don't really
Even
talk to
St
me.
Albans down in the south, there's that story of sort of the was it St Alban who
St
was
Alban, yeah.
killed and put in a well and so on. But it sounds a bit hubristic, doesn't it? This idea of Christians coming in to redeem the natural world. I can imagine people listening to this and saying, "Steady on, that sounds rather arrogant."
Well, for which I would only, never want to give that impression. I think an awful lot of the interactions with the natural world, such as trees in particular, we owe an enormous debt. The pagan sympathy for trees and the kind of pagan devotions around trees and the Druids and so on were really almost the exact opposite of this. So I wouldn't come in and say it's the traffic's one way in this direction at all. And I think our sympathy for the landscape in the early church reflects a sympathy that was there in the pre-Christians.
In the pre-Christian era. And, I suppose it's possible that there were pagan rituals of immersion that we just simply haven't been recorded. But there's something interesting, I think, with this question of immersion. I was swimming. I was doing this, what you were doing in the book, I suppose, last week in Sweden. So I was swimming every day in the lakes in Sweden at a Druid camp, and I was very aware of the fact that the water was dark, it's quite peaty there, and that I had to have trust in the benign nature of the water, that some great dark monster wasn't going to come out of the water, or sort of huge fish that would bite me. And there's something about entering into water that requires trust of the human. It's if the land is consciousness, what we can The water has always traditionally, represented the unconscious, the unknown,
Yeah.
the great depth, and so on. So there's something very magical, if you like, about if you walk into the water, say you wade into the water sort of waist deep, half of you is in the other world, and half of you is in this world. You're between worlds, as it were, and so I can totally see how. I mean, whether the pagans did it or not, the pre-Christians did it or not, is of academic interest. But perhaps we don't need to worry about that. We know now that it's a valid experience, and what makes your book great is that you not only give the history and the research that you've done academically, but you also actually go out and practice it, and you tell us about the adventures you have and the particular places you went to and the rituals that you performed there and so on. But now that we know that, an interesting question is to what degree this has been utilized in modern day paganism. So modern day paganism, naturism plays an interesting part because Gerald Gardner, the sort of one of the founders of the modern Wicca movement, and Ross Nichols, who's responsible for sort of reintroducing sort of spiritual druidry to a great extent in the world. So these two sort of founding figures of the modern pagan traditions of Wicca and druidry. They were both naturists, and one of the sort of lovely images that I have of these two guys sitting on the lawn at 5 Acres or at Spielplatz, talking about spiritual subjects and the goddess and the white goddess and all the rest of it, while the Blitz was sort of raining down on London 10 miles away or something like that. Extraordinary. So, and naturist resorts are places for bathing. There's always a swimming pool at a naturist resort, and often the sort of activities centre around the pool. And yet, bathing hasn't. I mean, maybe there's a very practical reason that in modern paganism, you'd need a swimming pool or a river or something but it doesn't play a part, does it, in modern pagan practice?
Well, it doesn't, and that's why I kind of think I don't. I looked at the evidence really as dispassionately as I could, and I came up with only negative associations around water, or shall we say, just kind of
if that's from the past,
certainly spiritual from the past, definitely. And then I think in modern paganism, and I know a lot of people into paganism, and I've met them partly through naturism, partly through researching early kind of Celtic spirituality and so on. And I think there is, in modern paganism, there isn't really, as far as I'm aware, any very devoted or any really advanced system or kind of practice or discipline of cold water bathing rituals. But there is nudity for various outdoor activities, such as in drawing a circle and so on outside. And I've known friends who's a Wicca who says he will draw a circle around him with a broom and will then
being skyclad is
skyclad, but it's skyclad and it's not waterclad, and I think that's interesting because it kind of ties up with what I found about the Celtic period. And remember the Picts, I talked about the Picts, where the water was seen as really quite kind of scary and had all these monsters in Pictland, and yet they were known for having this blue paint on their skin and being going around with nothing on or very little on. Commonly reported, and it's there on their own stones that they engraved, showing their warriors going to battle naked. And I think this inhibition about bathing may be connected to these skin patterns and paintings that they had. They didn't want to put the two together.
Oh, really?
So there was some kind of magic hid in the skin. As best guess I can come up with on the evidence, but I think the two would make sense. So there wasn't really, as we know, as far as we can tell, a real positive sense of water in Pictland anyway, as a real strong healing element and a place of immersions. And Ronald Hutton wrote a book about pagan Britain. His book there talks as well. He says, actually, to be honest, there isn't really any evidence of Celtic healing wells. We talk about them, but actually there's virtually none.
Oh, really?
So I think it's fair to say that there is a gap there. And in modern paganism, maybe it's a coincidence, but it does seem to mirror that. I don't know of any real devotional practices or places.
Well, maybe this
where
is
it's done.
This is something that you have helped to introduce into the world, and that pagans can take in the honoured tradition, as John Michael Greer once called it, of bricolage, which is this wonderful term of the way we all, this syncretic way in which we take great ideas from all sorts of different traditions and different people and different books to build our spiritual sort of path in the world. I mean, maybe this is something that we can do. For instance, the sweat house ceremonies. We know that there were sweat houses in Ireland. There's evidence of sweat house or sweat lodge type activities in Britain from the Neolithic period, I think, from very early on, or perhaps Bronze Age, of stones that have been reheated many times. And I believe archaeologists are in dispute. Some say that they were used for cooking, that you'd sort of make soup by sort of dropping hot stones in your bowl of bouillabaisse or something. And then other people say, well, they were reheated a lot because they were used in sweat house ceremonies. And we have tried on the Obod camps. We've tried with Ronald Hutton and Catelyn Matthews. We once sat around and tuned into what would a contemporary Druid sweat house ceremony look like, and we developed one. And we figured that the goddess Brigid would be a perfect goddess to preside over the ceremony. She is the mistress of fire and of water, which is of course what a sweat house is made up of, and that we would have various rounds. As you do in a sweat lodge ceremony, where you go out and get splashed with water. So there is interaction with water there. So and we decided that we would make this ceremony in a bender, so that you could stand up. You know, in a Native American sweat lodge, you're really trapped down in this sort of low structure, and you sit around the glowing stones. It's very powerful. But there's something about creating a space where you can actually stand up and lie down as well. So we were having people lying down. When they got incredibly hot, they would lie on the earth, and we would splash them with water. We would give them the 9 waves. Wonderful. 9 waves of blessings, which comes from the Carmina Gadelica. That midwives would give to a small wave of blessing for your hearth, a small wave of blessing for your home, a small wave of blessing for your kith and kin, and so on. So we would give these very hot people a splash of cold water for each wave, and so we developed a sweat house ritual which did incorporate water, actually. And I suppose a logical extension that your research and experience would suggest would be, why not site that by a cool pond or river or lake, so you can then immerse yourself in the water too. Or,
I mean, you've just given me an idea there.
Yes.
This idea of waves, to actually have a ritual that syncs with nature, and those waves can be provided by the environment, by the tide of the moon.
Well, yes. One of the nicest ceremonies I've done, the most beautiful ceremonies, was on a full moon in New Zealand. And you've lived in New Zealand, so maybe you know this place. What's it called? It's in the Coromandel. And it's opposite Slipper Island.
Hot water beach.
It was called the Prana Resort. This is wonderful New Age resort, which is no longer, unfortunately. But we sat in a cave which had glowworms in it, and to get to it, you had to go down the root of a Pohutukawa tree, down into this cave. It was just perfect. And we sat there, and I invited people to meditate there for as long as they wished, until they felt like they wanted to emerge from the cave. When they emerged from the cave, they were instructed to walk across to an area where we had a little bonfire going, to take their clothes off, if that's what they felt comfortable about doing, take their clothes off, and then to walk through this brilliant, beautiful bit of soft white sand with pine trees, out towards the ocean. And there, somebody very kindly was standing for us in the ocean. It was a full moon. And you would wade out into the sea, and then he assisted the waves by splashing you and said the 9 waves of blessing. 9 waves of blessing. And then you walked back to the bonfire, dried, and sat around, and we told the story of Taliesin.
You've got it there, haven't you? You've got the earth, where you're in a cave. You've got the tree, and you've got the moon, and you've got the water, and you've got the fire.
Yes.
This is pure elemental spirituality. And I can well see there is the role for the rhythm of the waves if you're looking at some kind of synchronization between humans and the environment, which paganism does so well in so many ways. And also, if you will accept that there are spiritual forces that move within water in various ways, which I think was there and is there in certainly in the early records of paganism. There's no real reason why it has to be seen as a purely negative thing if they're seen as somewhat dangerous, perhaps. I mean, there are, that's that's we're not all talking, fairies and light. I'm well aware that people nowadays understand that the spiritual realm is one of conflicts and emotions, and there's dark and there's light within it. So there's no harm in saying that water is a repository for spiritual charge, like a kind of battery, and to interact with that accordingly.
Well, exactly, because water's used. The idea of sort of blessing yourself with water at the when you come into a church.
Yes.
The font and so on. It's. I think you mentioned that your wife is in the Orthodox Church.
Russian Orthodox
Orthodox Church. And in the interview with Rupert Sheldrake, it wasn't an interview, it was a discussion about your book between Rupert Sheldrake and Mark Vernon. And they raised the topic of Orthodox Christianity. And Rupert Sheldrake said that the Orthodox theology would meld well, is perhaps the most sympathetic to ideas of the natural world being able to work with the forces of the natural world. And
absolutely. And I think if you look back at really raw kind of early Christianity, what is really wondrous and wonderful about it is this sense that the spiritual can inhabit and touch and grace all of creation, all of the physical world. And that is ultimately the idea of the sacrament, the idea that you have a bit of bread and a bit of wine or a bit of water in the font, which is somehow transformed by contact with the divine and raised up and elevated. And it's important that you think that something like the Eucharist or baptism, we now in the church, I guess, just look at that as being something for us as people dealing with us and our sinful nature. It's a very, very narrow, very restricted vision, and it's a very sort of kind of self-centered focus, very anthropocentric. But actually, if you look at it and you say, well, what's happening to the bread, to the wine, to the water, to the material world, that is also being elevated and raised up towards the divine. It should be radiating out in a 360 degrees to all that is around us, to the material world, and to see that all of creation is a spiritual realm. And it was Augustine who really narrowed everything down closely to original sin and to us as individuals as being bad, and us, the whole of basically the whole of creation is there just as a kind of backdrop to the grinding gears about our own anxiety, about our wickedness. I think it's very, very limited, and I think there is a real potential for a very wide cosmology. There's a whole kind of field of engagement with nature, with the natural world, which is really hardly touched at all by Christianity, and has been less and less over the centuries. And it's definitely a gap which paganism fills so beautifully in so many ways. And a lot of pagans I know, I talk to them, I've spoken a pagan conference, an academic conference with my research, and at the end of it they just went, yep, that sounds absolutely fair play to us, because I could see a lot more affinity with what they were saying and understanding about nature and their actions and so on. Certainly, if you talk to a bunch of evangelicals about stripping off and wading into the North Sea,
yes,
you might not get such a positive reaction.
So I guess you'd say that you've got more affinity with a sort of pagan worldview, perhaps, than say with the more extreme versions of Christianity, fundamentalist Christians and evangelical Christians and so on.
Oh, absolutely. I would say I probably hardly any affinity at all with them. Maybe on some doctrinal matters and so on. But I think when you have expressions of Christianity which basically say global warming isn't important, we can do what the heck we want to the environment, I would say I was about as far removed from them as it's possible to get. And there are expressions of paganism which I have enormous affinity with, and people I know and I've met and will go and do things with who I feel extremely comfortable with, and I think a kind of broad-minded view of the outer realms of what spirituality can do for us as a whole, for other people, and for the environment. It's essential, and I kind of, I think Christianity has lost contact with some of its early kind of positive and benign expressions in the landscape. And I look at Celtic spirituality now, and I do know that a lot of the rituals which were very, very important, which were raised up and which were elevated to the heights, talking to animals, living in the wilderness, adopting sacred trees, going and spending the night on sacred mountains, into caves, dark caves where snakes lurked, and so on, and then going into water. They did all of this, and it was celebrated. But we don't do it at all. Not, I do, but
Yes, but not many people
not many
do.
people do.
I mean, what do you? Of course, it's not all sweetness and light in early Celtic Christianity, is it? I mean, St Kevin at Glendalough sort of pushed a woman over a cliff because she was tempting him. What was his name? St Molin or somebody sort of killed. Was it killed birds or fleas because they distracted him from
his prayer.
From his prayers. You know, there are expressions of cruelty in the biographies of the early Celtic saints, which are a bit shocking.
Yes, and yet there's Kevin who also, while praying, held out his hand and a bird nested in it, and he continued praying for 40 days and nights.
But was that
until
just
the
after
bird
he
had-
pushed the woman over the cliff?
Well, one wonders really, and it's not enough atonement in any book, in my view. And negative views of women in religion are one of our. We've been bedeviled by it, and all religions have that to some extent. It's a terrible part, but it is there. And
It is there, isn't it? I mean, it's so common. Did you notice the other day? Pope Francis declared that they would change the words of the Lord's Prayer.
Oh yes.
It was absolutely fascinating. Where you're talking to God and you're saying, Our Father, etc. Lead us not into temptation. And of course, the suggestion there is that He's leading you into temptation, which is interesting theologically and problematic as well. And so they've changed the wording, haven't they? To let us not be led into temptation.
Do not let us fall into temptation.
Yes.
Yeah, so the idea is that.
So the burden of the burden of who's doing the leading is removed from God.
And the emphasis on is God is preventing us from going into temptation, rather than not actively leading us into it.
Yes, and I laughed when I read that because I thought, I wonder how many committees. You can imagine these earnest debates that have been probably going on for years.
Yeah.
Around that one phrase, lead us not into temptation.
Well, the dogma is, and that's something that, of course, in lots of expressions of paganism, you don't quite have these dogmatic doctrinal disputes. There's more.
There isn't a book. Yes,
no.
It's not a religion of the book,
Absolutely.
as you say. And so, how would you, imagine you've got your book here? What do you think the best possible outcome for this book, apart from, of course, it being a bestseller and you being able to move into some vast mansion in Beverly Hills, apart from it being a runaway success, what do you think, what would you like this book to do in the world?
Yeah, for me, it's was creating a dialogue between humans and the natural world, and a positive one. And the way I was going into nature and suddenly realising that a religion that aligned you very closely with the movement of nature, with the rhythms of the seasons, with the flowing of the waves and so on, was one where you actually would start to imbue the whole world with spiritual significance and importance, with a kind of nebulous sense that it was there to be loved and protected and cherished as a realm for the divine. So what I gathered from it was very much a sense, not so much a religion that focused on individual sins and our wickedness and so on, and things like pushing women off cliffs and so on, but a religion that actually saw that its primary expression, that the way it proved itself to the people, was the fact it would live in harmony with nature. And so the saints would go out there and they would show that you could live surrounded by birds who would come and nest in the hermits' huts. You would go there and you would be in the water. You could go and live in peace in the forest. And in Celtic Christianity as well, there's this real thing about adopting sacred trees, not cutting them down, not exploiting them. but they would save them, protect them. They say of Columba that his greatest fear was the sound of an axe falling on the trees around his monastery,
Oh,
because
really?
he didn't want people to come and harvest them.
Yes.
So this sense that somehow the whole of creation is part of the spiritual realm, and that our reconciliation to God is not about us being forgiven our pathetic individual miserable little sins that we accumulate in our life, but it's a reconciliation that goes all the way back to this alienation that Adam and Eve have in Eden, being cast out from the garden. With your relationship with the earth will become antagonistic from that moment. But a religion that says actually it is the work of holy men and women to put right, to re-synchronize you with the whole cosmos, and that means living in harmony with creation. And I have to say, I've gone to a lot of these holy natural places and thought, well, I'm going to strip off, it's going to be like Adam at the beginning of time, and I waded down to the beach and tripped over a plastic bottle, and it's like, there's your sin. There it is right there. It's not about me as an individual and whatever pathetic things I might feel bad about. They're nothing. What it is we have a disharmony. We have marred. We have defaced creation and the natural world. And what I would say is it's the journey for all spiritual men and women and anybody else in between who has a religion or a faith to kind of realise that there's a much bigger picture out there, and that we all are under one great vast sky, and there's much less narrow sectarianism, but a kind of joint effort, a joint will to place back that sense of reverence for nature that will allow us once again hopefully to restore some sort of balance in that order.
That was beautifully put. That was very eloquent, Nick.
I don't know where that came from.
Yes, it was very, very good. And I think as you were saying it, I had this picture of there's something about. I mean, because we're both naturists, we know this as an experience. If people haven't had this experience, it may seem unlikely that it's so. But that experience of being naked in nature. Sweet, sane nakedness in nature. Walt Whitman, who said that.
Oh, yeah.
Poet. There's a sort of sanity that comes over me. That's the only way, because it's humbling. There's nothing between you and the natural world, and you're vulnerable as well. I think people who don't know about it think of people who are naturists as sort of strutting, showing
Or
off,
parading, or
prancing, strutting,
words.
all those sorts of
Yeah.
words, posing. People use all those sorts of words to talk about it. But in fact, the experience is one of innocence, of being before the sort of the power of creation, with nothing to defend you.
Yeah.
And when you were saying that, the sort of image I had was of walking, of wading into the water, and it's because you intensify that feeling of that interface between your body, yourself, and the natural world that you get when you take your clothes off. You intensify it as you wade into the water, because you're getting much more sensory input coming in, especially if the water's cold. It's like all the bells are going on the captain's deck, as it were, ding, ding, ding.
Off, yeah.
We're off, sort of thing. And you and nature it's an encounter, a profound encounter, at a sensual level, at a sensory level, at an experiential level. And I think that's what you've, and I think pagans have found that with fire. We know about how good it feels to sit around an open fire. We know how good it feels to sit in a sweat house or a sauna and get really hot. But we need to. I think we need to build in more precisely the experience you talk about, as that the experience of water, the body and water. And so thank you for this. I think this is a real gift, and because you've written it both in a serious and academic way, but also in an experiential way, just telling stories. So it's very readable and witty as well. It's accessible too, and let's hope that more and more, because you brought in what's happened with the environment and the plastic and so on.
Yeah.
it's that vulnerability of being in nature, and then there's a particular beach that I go to on Ibiza that is very quiet and very private. It's like a little sort of private cove, and when I'm there, I meditate and bathe, just being at one with nature. And of course, what happens is, and more and more every time I go, it's more and more. There's plastic on the beach. There are syringes on the beach. You know, it's just
yeah.
horrible. You know, so what I do is I go with a bag, and you know, as you said, when you go on some of these trips, you end up filling up a bag with plastic. You know, you do your tiny little bit of
Yes.
helping to clear the world. But you can't hide from it. So part of the encounter now is grief-stricken, is sad, because it's not the encounter with pure nature, it's the encounter with defiled nature too. But that's something that as sort of mature, responsible people we have to face, and by undertaking this practice, you not only give yourself the experience of sort of death and rebirth in this strong sort of sensory experience, but you also confront the situation that we've created in the world, and the need to repair it.
Absolutely, and it's that irreducible simplicity of nakedness within that. When you approach the water, because we know even clothes now, you want a washing machine, you're going to put 500,000 microfibers into the environment, which will go into the water system, which will end up in the sea. We are making the sea as a soup full of these microfibers, and to go in, the only way to go in reverentially into water would be not to have anything synthetic about your person at all, and nothing that is artificial, nothing that's going to pollute. And I think that's something that any decent pagan would certainly respect, is the idea of the irreducible simplicity of that encounter with the raw elements of what make us human and what makes us part of that natural world. And it's essential to it, and I'd love being able to share that with you today.
Yes, no, thank you, and I think that's a great way for us to end, with the irreducible simplicity of going naked into the water, where you're not, because if you've just got a swimming costume on, you're actually polluting the water. It's a sad, strange, surprising discovery that has only been made fairly recently about microfibers. So what we need to promote or to work with is the simple, irreducible simplicity of going naked into the water to encounter the divine.
Absolutely, and on that we can both, and I'm sure pagans and all good-minded people could definitely agree.
Yes. Good. Well, thank you so much, Nick. So it's The Naked Hermit, A Journey to the Heart of Celtic Britain, published by SPCK, out this month, which is, what month is it? July.
Just out, yeah.
Just out. Lovely. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.